Welcome to the wrap-up of Down the Rabbit Hole. This is Dr. Mayfield from MindSureHealthcast.com. Continuing on a little bit about where we got to last time, talking about the concept of down the rabbit hole. I got some feedback that, of course, in this case, I mispronounced the author of Alice in her two books. His name is really Lewis Carroll, and for some reason I was probably drew a temporary blank, and the one that popped in normally is the right one, but in that case it was the wrong one. So it was Lewis Carroll who wrote about Alice and her adventures in Wonderland. Most of the material I shouldn't say most, all the material that I talk about is highly researched, and occasionally there may be a defect in my thinking in terms of either remembering exactly something or some of the ins and outs that I should. So I guess I have proven again that I'm far from being perfect. And actually I have found over the years that my accuracy factor has improved in terms of remembering what and when things happen. So I guess I'm steadily improving somewhat. And maybe within the next 25 to 50 years I will get it pretty well worked out. Contrary, of course, to what medicine has said for years, another one of those paradigms, you can't build new neurons. Now the new studies out indicate you can build new neurons and new neural networks, and you can rearrange the brain, called neuroplasticity, and regain functions that you may have lost because of some damage. So it's kind of interesting to have been in the field of medicine as long as I have, and have seen all the things change as one absolute today becomes a possibility tomorrow, and either never or pretty much always later. In other words, the outcome is constantly changing, and we're talking about paradigm breaking, and I don't have in this broadcast time to go into some of the things that you really ought to be thinking about. But I've decided that the next broadcast, and I want to tell you now so I don't forget at the end, is going to be called Beliefs and Paradigms Breaking Free. We're going to be talking about how we develop those beliefs and paradigms, how they control our lives, how they blind us, including our sensory input, and how to break loose or break them so we can improve our view of not only ourselves, but ourselves and the world. I think you will find it interesting. It's probably going to take 2 sessions. It probably could take 6 sessions, but no one's going to follow it that long, or at least not very many. I shouldn't say that. I have a few people who say, no, we need more and more. And then I have a lot of other people who say, well, if you can't sum it up in 5 minutes or 8 minutes, forget it. But it's not that simple. And of course, those are the people who probably need the paradigm breaking the most, because they've already decided they know it all, and or if it can't be encapsulated and fed to you like speedy relief from a pharmaceutical, then forget it, we'll move on. So I don't anticipate a lot of change in those people's lives upward. Now maybe downward, because if they continue with the attitude, of course, you're not going to be taking in new information that's going to ever alter if you're too much of a hurry to actually stop and really walk through the muck and the mire it takes to understand what's going on, number one, and number two, some options as to what you can do about it. Okay, so we started out by saying in the last broadcast that we get things all messed up and backward, and that's why I mentioned Alice and Down the Rabbit Hole about the Queen saying, off with her head. She said, you can't cut off my head, I haven't had a trial. The Queen says, we'll cut off your head, then we'll have the trial. And so it was kind of like the witch test up in New England in this country, back along the way. If you were accused of being a witch up in New England, you were given a test that could either prove you were innocent or guilty. And anyone could bring an accusation against you, an accusation, I'll get it right. Anybody could do that. You could say, and people did, well, she walked by my cat and my cat was scared and squalled. Or I was working with milk and my milk soured when she came by. And so then that means now you have had an accusation made against you, you have to do something about it. And so the something you have to do is that you have to go through the test. And of course it was a very interesting test. Your legs and arms were bound and you were thrown in a large tank of water. Now if you sank and drowned, you were innocent. If you came back to the surface, you were a witch and had to be burned at the stake. It was a very interesting test, and I kind of somehow get the feeling that any way you go, you don't win with that one. But that's kind of sometimes the way it's staged. And anyhow, we're working about getting information to you that is good for you, your health-wise. And before you can really become healthy, you need to know certain things about yourself and about what's going on in our world and what types of therapies we do. And of course, we don't ever have enough time. We could be on 8 hours in a row and still kind of scratch the surface of some of the subjects. And that's not feasible, nor are very few people going to listen to it or watch it for that long. So I try to summarize some of the main points enough to provoke you to go out and look. And so I mentioned at the beginning of this broadcast about the movie Matrix and taking the red pill and the blue pill. And so the next broadcast we'll be talking about the implications of taking the red and the blue pill, but beyond that, a lot more. I think you'll find it interesting if you're interested in change. If you're not interested in change, then you probably think it's a bunch of whatever you might want to call what you don't agree with, and let it go. So at any rate, I also mentioned the movie, What the Bleep Do We Know? It's very, very good to start you on the trek of expanding your belief systems and your paradigm. Expanding the paradigm. Now you don't have to do it, of course. It's always your choice. You don't have to eat good food. You can eat garbage all you want. You don't have to take anything that's going to help you get healthier. You can suppress every symptom that comes along until one day it can't be suppressed anymore and you're full of some kind of chronic illness such as cancer or whatever. I mean, that's your choice, and I respect that. I think everyone has the right to believe what they want to believe. I just hope that they have done some examination about what they believe before they make some of the major decisions that they do. So, I think that the movie What the Bleep Down the Rabbit Hole, which was the newer version of it, is a good movie to watch to at least introduce some different thinking. Now, again, it's your choice. Don't watch it at all, or if you watch it, don't agree with it, then it makes no difference to me. I wouldn't say I necessarily agree right down the line with everything that's in it, but the principles that it introduces, I think, are very important. And that is opening your mind and pulling the shades up and letting some light in. And as I say, the next broadcast, we're going to talk more about that. Okay, so I'm looking at medicine, and what has happened, of course, is that over the years we've gotten sicker and sicker. For a while we thought we had it under control with antibiotics. I mean, anything that came along, give somebody an antibiotic and they feel better. So, of course, we equated that with being well. And as I hope somewhere along the way, you'll come to the awareness that having no symptoms is not necessarily an indicator of health. In fact, in most cases in today's world, it is not. In fact, it's an indicator of just the opposite. And why do I say that? Because the symptoms that people get are the body's attempt to get rid of something that shouldn't be there. And in that process, if that is turned off or blocked, then whatever it was the body was trying to get rid of becomes deposited in the body and becomes the beginning of a future issue. And after doing it many times, number one, you usually end up turning off the immune system so it doesn't happen at all. And then you think, wow, I'm really healthy. I can eat anything, I can do anything, and I never get sick, I don't get colds, I don't get flus. And think that we're really healthy until all of a sudden one day our system comes apart. And then we think we have a new disease. And medicine, of course, is very content, modern medicine, to sell you things that will make you feel better. And unfortunately, I have to say that there are people within the natural health field that will do exactly the same thing. The only difference is the choice of what kind of suppressors they use to really make you feel better. Because there are things you can do that will turn off symptoms, the same with herbs or even high-powered nutrients, the same as a drug will, because they are drugs. All the drugs, as I mentioned, pretty much in early medicine came from herbs. Then they learned how to concentrate them and make them more potent. And then they learned how to duplicate many of them synthetically so they could patent them and give them a new name, and then they could make a whole lot more money on them because all the herbs were generic and they couldn't do that. So they were happy to come up with a way of creating a patentable product. And in almost every case that I can think of, the patentable product ended up being much more toxic than the original, because usually they stripped a single factor out of a combination, a synergistic combination, and said, well, this must be the active ingredient. Somehow they got the feeling that the other ingredients were inactive, and so they said, this must be the active ingredient, or ingredient, so that's what we're going to make. And they did that. But as they did that, people started to develop adverse effects. Now, taking a true herb at a minimal dose that actually is bordering on the low levels of homeopathy is, in fact, helpful, or actually can be curative. But taking a large amount of an herb can be very powerful in suppressing symptoms, the same as a lot of other things that come from plants can do. And, of course, the synthetic medications that are generated by the pharmaceutical industry. So, early on, investors in the pharmaceutical industry realized there was a lot of money to be made in making people feel better, and so they set up these massive research laboratories to go in and find out what these different chemicals will do inside the human body. And in many cases, they would find, after giving an animal, a lab animal to begin with, some kind of substance and do some blood studies, they say, wow, look at this. That cholesterol was pushed way down in that animal. And so evidently this product has something to do with the synthesis of cholesterol in the body. And so then they started studying the liver chemistry really heavily and determined, oh yeah, what it does, it goes into a liver cell and blocks the ability of the liver cell to synthesize cholesterol. And of course they give you a certain dosage range, which means it won't totally shut it down because you would die if you had no cholesterol. And so also, of course, to do that, you would have to damage the liver so badly that you would die anyhow. And so supposedly all the drugs that lower cholesterol, the people are supposedly to have their liver monitored for liver damage while they're taking it. And so we've mentioned the cholesterol thing before. I'm not even going to get into it today, but just to say it's a good example of how you take a substance that you're researching and find that it can affect something in the body, and then you turn around and try to figure out how can you get people to think they need that, and then to get a marketing company that's able to sell the public on the idea that it could be a big problem if you don't do it, and therefore the public comes clamoring saying, well, what are we going to do? What are we going to do? And then the pharmaceutical says, we have the solution. And so if you get into the background, we're going to do a broadcast on that in more detail, on selling medicine and selling sickness. And you'll find out how that's done. There's a huge international marketing company that takes in billions of dollars a year that handles clients like pharmaceuticals, and the pharmaceutical tells them what the issue is that they want them to create and tells them then what the solution is. And so they do massive marketing, especially in the U.S. In other countries, they can't go directly to the public with prescription drugs like they do here, but especially here, and in certain ways they can promote. It doesn't necessarily have to be on television or whatever, but there's ways they can promote it. So these big agencies make millions of dollars per client on marketing a new issue. And I've watched issues come into existence. Cholesterol is one. I also watch, and I knew a doctor actually, who was a personal friend of one of the researchers from the Framingham study, and they learned a lot out of that, but it wasn't that cholesterol was going to be better for your heart and so forth, but they learned some things about the benefits and disadvantages of the benefit of having cholesterol and the disadvantage of pushing it down too far. So they knew all that when they set on the campaign, but the public bought into it. And I remember back when they used to go around all the big malls and in big cities, and they would put some people in there doing instant cholesterol checks. And so this person that they had, many times it was a nurse, sometimes a lab technician, and sometimes just somebody who was willing to do it. And so they would take a drop of blood and they would put it in this little machine, and they'd say, ooh, look how high your cholesterol is. You should immediately contact your doctor. And so they did a big sell on that, and it worked out extremely well. When you have a drug that brings in billions per year, I'd say you got a good seller. There's some bad things about it, but and it doesn't, of course, in my mind, have any effect on your cardiovascular system as far as plaquing and or heart attacks. But the evidence is out there, and more doctors are writing about it now, and at some point it's going to come up that in fact it was not true that lowering cholesterol actually improved your cardiovascular condition. That inevitably has to come up. It's starting to more now. There's more MDs, more PhDs, more books being written on it. So it's just a matter of time that finally the public is going to say, oh, okay. But in the meantime, they've already started, at least in one case, or I shouldn't say one case, one type of problem that they have grabbed onto. And this is a doozy too, because number one, it scares people, and number two, it will take years and years of people taking cholesterol-lowering drugs to even know if it really has any effect, but in the meantime, they will maybe have made several $1 billion more. And that is that I found out about 3 or 4 years ago, maybe 5 years ago, that they were starting to advocate that maybe that there are some preliminary indications that it might be that if you took this drug over a long time, it may slow down the development of Alzheimer's. Now, you can imagine, basically, how long it's going to take to demonstrate factually, one way or the other, that it doesn't do that. Well, of course, I don't think it does anyhow, but if they say it and they put their PR into it, you know what's going to happen? Everybody's going to forget that they were scammed for billions and billions of dollars all those years taking that drug to avoid heart problems, and it was not effective for that. And not only that, it had adverse effects. But let me throw this in to those of you who are perceptive. As it says in the Bible, let he that hath ears, let him hear. Now, what has been happening with Alzheimer's? It's been going up. How many people in this country are on cholesterol-lowering drugs? Many for several years already. If, in fact, it were true, I think we'd be seeing some sharp indications of at least of a slowing down, if not stopping, of new cases of Alzheimer's, if there is a relationship. But you know, it's strange about humankind. We don't carry our thinking that far. We just kind of, whatever hits the evening news, oh, okay, okay. And we don't, in our minds, say, now wait a minute, I've been scammed all this time. I spent every year thousands of dollars to take this stupid drug, and now what's happened? It wasn't going to help me cardiovascular-wise anyhow. And on top of it, I just saw some new figures of like, at one time it was 50-some%, but I just saw some new figures of about 70% or so of the people who have a cardiovascular event have low cholesterol or normal cholesterol, or what medicine calls normal cholesterol. Now, that is sure strange in light of the fact that they're saying you take this to lower your cholesterol so that won't happen. I gave you information before. There's something called the Cambridge Institute, who has put out a lot of material for the public and for doctors. But you can go on their website, and they have one on the cholesterol scam, and it's done by a large group of doctors and researchers, and they go into it in detail. I don't have time on this broadcast today to go into it, but I think it's important. So what I'm saying is that we are looking at symptoms, we're treating symptoms, but if symptoms isn't the problem, or symptoms aren't the disease, why are not we finding out what the cause is and correcting that? Well, I can think of one big reason. If we really dealt with the cause, then people wouldn't be so sick, and if people were not so sick, we wouldn't sell so many drugs. But if every few weeks or months we can have people coming back for more symptom suppression, and then in a few days they feel better, and in most cases, I'd say maybe 80%, this is pretty well established over the years, 80% of those people feel better anyhow if they did nothing. They think, wow, this stuff worked pretty good. In fact, there's strong indication the more suppressive agents you take for things like flus and so forth, the longer it lasts and the more difficult it is for the body to clear it out. There's just so many details I could bring in on all of this and then put them together so you would kind of get the picture. But all I can do is give you some pieces and hope that you jump into looking into it yourself, because that's where you can be convinced, not because I say it. The other big thing that I really wanted to mention that I think was very important has to do with the trust that people have. Here they are, and when I say they, a large percentage of the public, buy whatever's sold to them, as I say, on the evening news, and then they turn around and and they don't ever question it. They just accept it. And of course, I'm thinking in particular the germ theory of disease. There's so many basic assumptions about that it's outlandish. It's hard to deal with because there are so many exceptions that you really would have to go into it and do a decent study. Now, I mentioned to you before, and it's probably a good idea to get this free printout of a small book that was written many years ago, 1949, called Bacteria Incorporated, and they kind of go into the whole thing a little bit about the germ theory. Now, you know, when it really gets down to it, medicine still says it's a theory, the germ theory of disease. And why is it a theory? Because it's never been absolutely proven. Now everybody accepts that, and they buy that, and they buy everything that said, well, we got to kill those bacteria. And so when you look into it, you find that it's not that simple. And on top of it, they know it. You know, when I say they know it, I mean the pharmaceutical establishment knows it. There's no way that they don't have all those very intellectual biochemists and researchers that don't have a pretty good background idea of the whole history of the germ theory and other things. But they're not going to mention it because they make a fortune on it, selling you antibiotics. And in this country, there's tons of antibiotics. And there's a really good book written by an MD called The Antibiotic Paradox. It's very difficult to find. It came out and it didn't stay out very long. And there's a couple of others on the market that are good, but that one was really good. And the one I told you about earlier, The Body is the Hero, about the abuse and misuse of antibiotics, even if it were true. He says, Dr. Glasser, who's a world-renowned immunologist, that maybe once or twice in our life something might happen unusual that might require antibiotics. And how do we measure that against the fact that many people are taking either ongoing antibiotics or taking a prescription at least once a month or every 2 months, and just this is on an ongoing basis. And as I've said so many times, antibiotics will suppress symptoms. They will turn off the immune system. They will kill off bacteria and stop an inflammatory process. And hence you will feel better. But the question is, are you better? And nobody seems to look behind the curtain. They always accept it at face value. Oh, well, yeah, I feel better now. Well, that's true. And I mentioned if you get an organ transplant and they gave you massive drugs to turn off all your immune system, you're going to feel good because nothing reacts. Nothing bothers you until something wipes you out. And so that is the problem with ongoing suppression of the immune system. Now, we have talked before, and that it is brought up in this book called Bacteria Incorporated, and it's going to challenge your thinking a little, but once you get into it, you're going to find that it's quite interesting because we get into the concept of pleomorphism. Now, I think it's important to know that because in pleomorphism, it really means that bacteria have many forms, not monomorphism. Now, it's easier to sell monomorphism because then you can sell different chemicals to kill these different forms. I studied with some of the top doctors in Germany and Austria and Switzerland. And these are guys who have been studying all this stuff for years. The Germans have been doing homeopathic medicine since Samuel Hahnemann in late 1700s. they have a lot of background of information. And so, when you really get down to it, the bacteria are synergistic, and I mentioned before that people say that we have normal flora in the body. That's true. But as I say, there's a pile of things that is taught or thought, and as people are led to believe, that's just not accurate. And so the germ theory was never proven totally. That's why it's called the germ theory. But we've operated on it, so we come out with hand washes to kill bacteria. We got sprays to kill bacteria. And the fact is, those all serve a purpose, and I'm not going to take the time today to get into all the ramifications, except to say that nature has provided a cleanup crew for every human, every animal, the ground, and even plants that help get rid of poisons, so that when they die, they go back to dust and they don't contaminate the earth. And see, plants, insects are one of those with plants. It depends on the type of plant and so forth. Mushrooms are ways of getting rid of a lot of decaying wood and so forth, or decay material in the soil. And so all these things are provided by nature. And so sure, we could go around killing off all that stuff, but is that going to make things better? And I say nature, after millions and millions of years, probably has come to a better balance and knows a lot more about what works and what doesn't than Johnny-come-latelys who now think because they've learned a few things they know it all. It always kind of reminds me when I was in high school, we had a boys' choir or chorus, and one of the songs we sang was a song about old man Noah. And one line of that just frequently reverberates in my head. The song says, "Old man Noah knew a thing or two. He was a grand old man." Old man Noah knew a thing or two. Because he knew a thing or two, he thought he knew it all. And what I have found is some of the biggest critics are the people who haven't bothered to study anything. They have assumed certain things, and they have a paradigm and a belief system, and so they just automatically block things out. Now, pleomorphism goes way back, and the book Bacteria Incorporated actually cites a study that was done way back, that was published in the Journal of Infectious Diseases in January of 1914. That's a couple years back. And it's interesting because they're talking about this idea of pleomorphism. I've said it before, if you change the environment, a bacterial form that normally would live in that environment, because it lives off the products that are produced in that environment, it uses for food. So it serves a dual purpose. It feeds itself and it clears up the environment in which it lives. Okay, so they always talk about good bacteria and bad bacteria. Well, they basically all do the same thing. But, of course, I wouldn't want to put soil bacteria in my body because it was designed by nature to live in the soil. So that's one of those unusual situations where the bacteria could be an issue if you've loaded yourself up with some bad. But not all the soil bacteria even is bad. So what I'm getting at is here this that was known way back in 1914. And it's called transmutations within the Streptococcus pneumococcus group. And here's a case where they're doing coccoforms. And what they did is by changing the environment, they changed from one type and one diet to another type with a different diet. So they were transmuted, or they're pleomorphic. Now, it goes way beyond that. And, you know, it's hard to find anything new related to that because nobody bothers to look into it. However, a few years ago, I ran into an article in Scientific American about a researcher who was doing some really complex analysis. So what he did, he took blood, human blood, and he put it in an ultracentrifuge. Now, an ultracentrifuge means one that runs at thousands of RPM. I mean, it really spins. And most of them, you have to lock the lid down in case something let go, that something could be flying out of there like a bullet. And so when he was done spinning it down, which is what they call using a centrifuge, you spin it down, he noticed an unusual layer of something. He didn't know what it was. He'd never seen it before, but of course he hadn't been working with a ultracentrifuge. And so he pipetted out a little bit of it and he started to study it. And he had never seen it before, and it was not in any of the books on hematology or microbiology. And so he was at a loss. So he wrote an article about it. He said it seems to have some kind of metabolism, not necessarily like a full Krebs cycle of a human cell, but it seems to have an abbreviated type of energy production cycle in it. And so since it had no name, it had never been named before that he knew of, he called them microbodies, which I guess is a good generic name. There's a bunch of microbodies in there. But I haven't heard anything much about that in a long time until most of you, or maybe some of you, have heard of dark field microscopy. You know, in dark field microscopy, I studied with several doctors in Austria and Germany, and from England and some other areas actually, who look at the blood, fresh blood, under dark field microscopy. And under dark field microscopy, you see living blood. In other words, you take a fresh drop of blood, you put it on a slide, put a cover on it, and you don't shine bright light through it, which masks a lot of things. You actually have a dark background, and you show light across the surface, which highlights all the different little things that are in it. And so under dark field microscopy, you see a lot of things you don't see otherwise. And I remember I've done it on and off. I've probably done several thousand blood studies with dark field microscopy, and I've been to several training programs both in the U.S. and abroad. But unfortunately now the FDA frowns on it. They don't want doctors looking at the blood with dark field microscopy, which right off raises a flag to me. Why do they not want you looking at the blood? Because you're going to see things in the blood you would not normally see under bright field. Because under bright field, you let it dry, you put a stain on it, sometimes you heat it a little bit, and then that's the way you look at it. So all the elements in the blood are dead, frozen, stabilized, and you can't see only the biggest objects because the rest of them with the bright background are overrun by light and you can't see their presence. And so anyhow, I learned about it many, many years ago, and so I started doing it with a lot of people. And there was just one occasion many years ago that I had a patient who was from Japan, and she was married to an American. And so they came to my office. They both had health problems, and too much American diet for her, I think. Anyhow, they came to my office, and when she saw that, she said, you know, I have a good family friend who's coming to the U.S. He is in Japan, a hematologist, well known. A hematologist is someone who studies the blood. She said, he's coming over here for this special program in, I think it was Massachusetts, so he's coming to visit me before he goes back to Japan. Would you mind if I brought him in and let him see the dark field? And I said, well, no, I don't mind. I said, I would think as a specialist in hematology, he would have seen things with dark field, but maybe not. So she brought him in, and so he's sitting behind her, and I take one little drop of blood, put it on the microscope slide, and put it under dark field. And as I say, it's very powerful, but it also shows up all kinds of micro things. So as I focused it and it came up on the video screen, he was sitting there looking and not saying a word. I mean, he was bending forward actually, looking at that. And there were all these little things dancing around in the blood. Well, according to modern medicine, the blood is sterile and therefore there's nothing in it that could be live other than parts of your own body, like red cells and white cells and platelets, etc. And or food that has gone through the digestive process. So he's looking and looking, and so he didn't say anything. So finally I turned to him and I said, have you ever seen anything like this before? With a puzzled look on his face, his response was no. Now here's a man who studied in some of the top institutions in the world, is an MD who's a hematologist specialist, and supposedly should know everything about the blood, and he'd never seen it before. So in a sense it didn't surprise me, because it's not taught in medical schools. They used to diagnose syphilis with dark field microscopy because you could see little spirochetes under dark field. But most of the doctors quit using microscopes, and a few years ago, as I say, the FDA came out very negative about even using dark field microscopy. And so, anyhow, I'm saying all that to say that I keep looking to see what's happening, if anybody, any place, is doing anything that kind of lends some credibility to all this. And so, interestingly, I ran across a study done at, it was actually published in the Journal of Clinical Microbiology in 2002. That's pretty new stuff. And it was done by a group of researchers, and the location, I think, was in, well, I don't know if it says, yeah, it probably does. Oh yeah, the McGill University of Medicine, and Montreal, Quebec. Now, I thought it was interesting because the title of it is, are there naturally occurring pleomorphic bacteria in the blood of healthy humans? Okay, now according to the concept of pleomorphism, there are pleomorphic things of various types depending on the environment of the blood. And the studies go way back. Now you can read this for yourself if you want to look it up, by Antoine Béchamp, a French researcher who was an MD and a biochemist. And he did all these studies, and he was one of the first people to see this under the microscope. And so he called them microzyma. And at the end of his work and publishing, at the end of the 1800s, it was in the late 1800s, he published a book called Blood and Its Third Anatomical Element. Now back then, they considered that there was only two things in the blood, which was the red cells and the white cells. Later they came up with platelets, and there's a lot of question about platelets as to what they are and so forth, but I don't think you would call them a cell in the true sense of the word, but in some people they don't show up until the blood has been sitting for quite a while after it's taken out of the person, and in other times the whole thing clumps up with platelets like it's coagulating, which is what it's doing. Anyhow, he's the first one that viewed these forms, and he called them microzyma, and later a German researcher by the name of Professor Gunther Enderlein took up where Béchamp left off, and he did further studies and verified it, wrote a lot of material on it, and we don't have the time to really discuss all that in detail. Sometime we may do that in real detail, more than we have now. But at any rate, it was verified again and again, and there was a big researcher up in Canada by the name of Gaston Neesens, who also developed a powerful lens system that raised the power of optical microscopy way up high. And so I've heard him speak. I've been to Montreal. Actually, it's Sherbrooke outside of Montreal, but it's in Quebec. And anyhow, he had a professor of, it was either hematology or microbiology, from the local university come over one day, and he took a drop of his blood, the professor's blood, put it under the dark field microscope, brought it up into focus onto a TV screen, and the guy sat there looking at it and saw all these little things dance around his blood. And guess what his response was? I see it, but I don't believe it. And he got up and walked out. Now talk about a strong paradigm. In any case, this study was done in Canada. Are there naturally occurring pleomorphic bacteria in the blood of healthy humans? Okay, here's what they say. In our search for spirochetes involved in Alzheimer's disease, because there's some people thinking maybe that's an issue, we observed pleomorphic bacteria in the blood of healthy human subjects by dark field microscopy. This was a surprising finding, since it is generally acknowledged that the bloodstream in healthy humans is a sterile environment. Wow. Okay, so here's what they said. In this report, we present evidence based on molecular phylogenetic techniques and light and electron microscopy, as well as other conventional microbiological methods, for the existence of a population of bacteria in healthy human blood. In view of the apparent controversial nature of our findings, it was encouraging to note that blah, 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 and they go through a lot of things. But they were able to prove, and see, they have a photograph, but I don't think you can really tell. But I can tell you that they sometimes take on different forms. In fact, the concept is, that goes over to Austria and Germany and Europe, that these bacteria live in your blood all the time, but their purpose is to help the body. Now, which they all do. The ones that live in your throat help you, the streptococcus. The ones that live in your nose, staphylococcus, help your nasal area. So they really, in fact, do that. However, when I see the forms that they're showing here in this photomicrograph, I know that this person isn't so healthy. They may not have any symptoms. Getting back to what I said earlier, but they're sure not healthy, and I don't have time to go into the details why. But here's the idea. When a person really is healthy, and there's not a lot of junk to be taken care of, if you see any of these at all, they would look like tiny little bright dots, barely visible. If your body gets more poison, they will get larger. And as they get larger, they can begin to change their form. So they change from a dot that's almost like a viron to there's another form in between in microbiology, and rickettsia. Then they look more like rickettsia. As time goes on and you get more poisoned in your body, they change to what looks like long, squiggling little worms of different shapes. Some are going to be short. Most of them have a little knob-like on the two ends. And eventually they start showing up inside the red cells, because now the red cells are getting poisoned. And so these things work in trying to keep the body clean. That's my take on it. Okay, so the theory goes that as they continue to morph, as you continue to get sicker, at some point they start to become a fungal form. So if you really look at it, in the beginning they're almost like a viral form. Then they become through some different stages of a bacterial-looking form. And then as you get very sick toward death, they become a fungal type form. And when the body dies, the fungal form that they change into helps to disintegrate the body back to dust. Now, remember I said that funguses that live on dying stumps and tree limbs and so forth are consuming it back to dust. And so anyhow, there's a whole lot more to it, but that kind of gives you the general picture. Now, I will say that they always find this fungal form in corpses that have been exhumed, and they also find this fungal form have in mummies that go back for a long way, hundreds if not thousands of years. So there's a whole lot to it, but it's a whole section of medicine that is avoided, and I can see why. First of all, you couldn't kill these, I don't believe. You may change their form, because if you take antibiotics, you're going to change the environment of the blood, and they may change their form, but you're going to kill them off, because that's what Dr. Béchamp found out way back in the 1800s, that you could not get rid of them. They have a service to perform, and they do that service. They are built to do it, and they are capable of making the transformations necessary to make it happen. Okay, so enough about that. I hope I've tweaked your interest enough that you might want to look into it. And if you do, there's a book called The Hidden Killers by Gunther Enderlein, that I think Amazon carries. I think it's on my website, as well as Antoine Béchamp's Blood in its Third Anatomical Element, who would give you a little bit more background in it, and after that, it's yo-yo. You're on your own on search engines to see what you can dredge up. Now, one more fast thing is that I get frustrated because people put their total trust in all these fads out there, whether in natural medicine or standard traditional medicine. I know that if you give a powerful enough herb, you can turn off the immune system. The same as you can drugs that turn off the immune system. I know that you can take fish oil, for example, and take large doses of it, and it acts like a steroid in the body, and it will shut down inflammation. Now, have we found the cause of the problem and solved it? Of course not. So there are those in natural medicine who are trying to be medical doctors without using medical drugs. And there are medical doctors who want to get into alternative medicine and still try to apply natural medicine like they would regular drugs to suppress symptoms. None of them bothering to find out the real cause. And to me, if you don't get back to the root cause, the person keeps getting worse. And if you keep suppressing the body getting rid of stuff, it really gets worse. And I guess that's not the worst part of it. What really bothers me the most is that even in light of all that, the FDA has kind of declared war over the years on natural therapies coming along that have been around for thousands of years, trying to discourage it because it cuts into the pharmaceutical business. And they've done pretty much everything they can, and I've mentioned before, if one herb, like chaparral for example, there was one case of one person who developed an inflammation of the liver, had a lot of health problems, and took some chaparral, and they developed inflammation of the liver, and they found out they were taking the chaparral. They immediately, the FDA says, well, it could have been caused by the chaparral, and so we're going to have to take that off the market. And they did. They pulled it for one case of maybe. On the other hand, Vioxx and some of these other COX-2 inhibitors that came on the market, which I said in advance are going to kill a lot of people, finally got pulled because there was so much bad press, there were so many lawsuits, and they couldn't keep the lid on it, and so they were forced to tell the drug companies, well, we've got to withdraw that. Now, the reason it came out was as a painkiller. Everybody had all these bad arthritic problems, especially rheumatoid, and it was touted as the miracle painkiller because it only inhibited the COX-2 circuits in the immune system instead of the 1 and 2. And hence, it was going to give people relief. Okay, well, they did. They released it on the market, and it happened. More and more people were being injured or dying with it. And the interesting thing is, it stayed on the market for several years, at least long enough for the drug companies to gain back, because it became an instant big seller, and they took in billions with it, so they were able to reclaim all their expenses of generating the drug and getting it approved, which anymore I don't think takes very much. There's now shortened methods of approving one. You don't have to do a whole lot to get it approved. Anyhow, I mean, if it's a drug. Now, if it's a natural substance, it probably will never get on the market. Because most natural people can't make the kind of money. If somebody came into my office and I said, well, yeah, we've got this really good substance that could really help in your immune boosting and your cancer problem, but it's going to cost you $3,000 or $4,000 a treatment. Wow. Unconscionable. How could you even consider charging people money like that? But yet they put out a synthetic chemical that maybe costs 25 to 50 cents to make and sell it for $3,000 to $5,000 per treatment, and nobody even questions it. It's okay. And if the person dies, it's okay, because after all, they did everything they could for them. Well, they didn't do everything they could. They do everything that they were making a lot of money off of to help them. And I hate to say it that way, but when I read the stuff that's happening, it sure has the smell of that, to say the least. Now, I was just going to bring this in because I found this big article came out, and I was talking about Vioxx and these COX-2 inhibitors, and let's see, this was in 2009. Health industry. Top pain scientist fabricated data in studies, hospital says. What? Not an MD. They wouldn't do that. They're upright people. They're out there to help people. A prominent Massachusetts anesthesiologist allegedly fabricated 21 medical studies that claimed to show benefits from painkillers like Vioxx and Celebrex, according to the hospital where he worked. Ooh. Bay State Medical Center, Springfield, Massachusetts, says that its former chief of acute pain, Scott S. Rubin, had fake data used in the studies, which was published in several anesthesiology journals between 1996 and 2008. No wonder it killed all those people. First of all, it wasn't even going to do what it was supposed to, only in a few cases, and who can tell whether they were placebo effects or not. But they knew that it was killing people, and guess how many people it appears that is probably known. Not how many probably really were, but how many were known and kind of put it together with these drugs. It was known that about 150,000 people died. No, they didn't get injured, they didn't get an inflamed liver, they actually died. And they never pulled the drug till at least 150,000 were killed, and so many people were bringing lawsuits that the FDA had to give the appearance that they were doing their job, so they finally pulled it from the market. Now, that's not even, I'm running out of time, I see. This is the last broadcast on this, so I need to get it all in. One more case I want to bring up. I don't know how many, and guess what? I don't think you probably heard this on the evening news. I don't think too many of the major networks are going to run too much stuff that's negative to pharmaceuticals and the medical industry when they take in a high level of their income from advertising from the pharmaceutical industry. So I don't think they're going to shoot themselves in the foot. So you just don't see these kind of stories. And besides, I've been told there are medical editors that look at the news services and pull anything that looks like it could be detrimental to the medicine or the pharmaceuticals. I can't verify that yet for a fact, but I've heard it from some very reliable sources. Now, I'm just going to throw one other one in. It's up to you to go look it up. I know it's true because I've printed it out myself. Several years ago, a lot of people complained about vaccinations and the damage, especially from MMR, and the relationship to autism. And without going into the whole story, because it would take me a little while to tell it, one prominent pediatric gastroenterologist from Great Britain who was the head of a group of people who, after studying their files with complaints from their patients, that after they got an MMR injection, the child started developing gastrointestinal problems and then they became autistic. They looked at their cases and they said, finally, let's write a paper about this. It looks like there is enough significant evidence to warrant a further study. They didn't say we absolutely say it, but they said there's enough evidence to warrant a further study. It went to the peer review committee of the Lancet, which is the worldwide medical journal that has the top information published there. And their peer review committee, who were also pediatric gastroenterologists, peer reviewed it and said, yes, it appears that there is sufficient question that it needs further study. So they okayed the publication. It was published, and immediately Dr. Wakefield was attacked, because this was the head name on it, by the British Medical Journal, by a high-level executive, and ended up actually telling a bunch of lies about him. But before it was done, Dr. Wakefield lost his license. And in the meantime, Dr. Wakefield became rather irritated, because he never made the statement that it was definite. He said it needed further study. Well, anyway, they said a bunch of things about him. So he hired investigators, because he wasn't going to take that whole thing lying down. So the investigators found out that the gentleman from the British Medical Journal who had spearheaded this whole thing against him happened to be on the payroll of Merck company, who actually manufactured the vaccine. And needless to say, Dr. Wakefield has filed a massive lawsuit against him, this guy, and other individuals, I think one of the networks who ridiculed him, and in this country. And it's going to be interesting to see how the outcome of that is. I think it's probably either close to trial or it's possible it's in trial now. I don't know. I have a copy of the actual lawsuit. So I know it's a fact. Most of the things I tell you are fact. I have something to document it, unless I'm speculating, and if I speculate, I try to remember to tell you I'm speculating. Okay, so in this country, a lot of people complain to the U.S. Congress that there seemed to be some kind of relationship between the MMR vaccine and autism. At least the mercury in it, if nothing else. I think it's more than that, but that's my opinion at this point, and a lot of other people's opinion. And so the Congress ordered the CDC, Center for Disease Control, to do a study and see what they thought about it. So they went through supposedly a very extensive study, and finally they published a report that says, after considering all the evidence we can find, we conclude that there's no relationship between autism and the MMR vaccine, or the mercury in the vaccine. So, it's all laid to rest, right? Well, a while later, the person who worked at the CDC, who headed this whole report, kind of quietly resigned from the CDC and took a very high-paying position at Merck Pharmaceutical. And the people who knew about these reports, the real ones, were sworn to secrecy. And anyhow, one of the people have decided to be a whistleblower, and they finally reported to somebody again who was investigating all this, yeah, there really was enough evidence to show a connection. It was altered. The data was altered so that it would look like there wasn't any. And so the report that was released was basically a lie. And so a lot of thousands, millions of people are still being immunized based on the fact that there really is no evidence. And of course the cases of autism continue to increase, and juvenile and young child gastrointestinal problems. So the whistleblower was also had access to the real documents. And so anyhow, I've been kind of following that. But it doesn't surprise me because some other things. But as I say, the web gets very complex and there's not enough time to talk about the whole thing at this point, except to say, do your homework, start digging. But I don't think you see that story on the CDC or on the evening news unless it gets diluted or poo-pooed or something. But I thought it very interesting. And I know a lot more that you probably ought to know. But our subject doesn't happen to be vaccinations today, so we won't get into that in any more detail. And I think we have provided you with enough provocation to maybe you might want to look a little deeper. And if not, then that's fine. That's your privilege and it's your body. And I believe that people are free to make their own decisions regarding their body. I don't think the government has a right to come in and force anybody in any kind of treatment. I think it's your right. If you want to do something and it kills you, I think it's your right. And if you want to take a new drug that's out that hasn't been really heavily tested, because once a drug is first released, it has not been heavily tested, and it kills you, well, that was your right to do that. And I'm not going to criticize you for it, and I'm not going to criticize the doctor for prescribing it if you ask for it. But I might criticize him for not maybe waiting a while and maybe doing his homework more before he starts prescribing it. So I think we've come to the end, and don't forget that next time we're going to be talking about beliefs and paradoxes, breaking free. And in the meantime, I think I've given you enough to tweak your interest. All you have to do is get on the National Center for Vaccine Information. There's all kinds of places. You can get on the search engine and you'll have pages and pages of information from MDs, DOs, PhD researchers, I don't care who they are, pharmacists. However, the only ones you're going to ever hear about on the news are the ones of those groups who say it's very important that you must do that. Oh, recently the CDC had to make another apology. A lot of people were getting sick and even getting the flu from the new vaccine. And they said, well, it appears that it didn't really have any of what was needed. Well, it never does because they don't know what the flu is going to be. So they make it based on past stuff and throw it together so they can get a vaccine out because people have to have their flu shots. That's my satire for the day. And I guess I'm finished for now. So we look forward to seeing you at our next broadcast at mindsyourhealthcast.com. In the meantime, be healthy.